Were the ancient Hebrews visited by time-traveling men of the future? Or were they mistaken? Was what they believed to be God actually future spacemen? There are two basic traditional interpretations of the Bible. One, a supernatural being influenced the lives of the early Hebrews. Two, the Israelites' God was imaginary. In most issues debated by opposing extremists, we find that the truth often lies somewhere in the middle. Maybe the Hebrews were involved with a real phenomenon, as the Judaic, Islamic, and Christian faith advocate. But instead of crediting the scriptural events to an actual divinity, perhaps the Israelites were contacted by technological and biological entities, by spaceships and space beings. This explanation would satisfy many religious as well as atheistic adherents. It's not too surprising then that since the 1950s, a number of theories have been proposed that support this middle-of-the-road space-age view. We are dealing with three main expositions. First, the ancients mistook astronauts and spaceships for gods. Second, God is a super-technological spaceman. And finally, the angels were dispatched in UFOs by God. However, what if there's a different explanation? One theory proposes that these ancient astronauts, if they existed at all, were actually Earthmen, time travelers who came from a future universe or dimension. What proof is there to support this hypothesis? To begin with, we have biblical prophecy. In the scriptures, there are hundreds of detailed predictions directed by the prophets at certain individuals, towns, cities, and nations. All have come true with amazing accuracy. How can this be? One possible explanation for this phenomenon is that of time-traveling spacemen who were in communication with the prophets. Besides fulfilled prophecies, the Bible also has verses depicting spaceships and astronauts. In 1974, Bantam Books published the Spaceships of Ezekiel, authored by Joseph Blumrich, a highly respected NASA engineer. In his manuscript, Blumrich writes about spacecrafts and spacemen encountered in the Old Testament by the prophet Ezekiel. Although originally he had set out to disprove the hypothesis that Ezekiel had seen a spacecraft, after a thorough examination, he was convinced it was true. In the story, Ezekiel was shown the future by God, who was riding in a unique and elaborate vehicle. He was given the task to deliver various messages. God was accompanied by multiple angels. Ufologists began to point to the possibility of interpreting this experience as witnessing a spacecraft rather than God. Ezekiel first saw the spaceship in 593 BC whilst he was exiled in Babylon. It was by the Sheba River that he looked up and saw a great cloud with fire flashing forth from its midst. 4 oblong structures were then seen descending from the middle of the cloud. As the vehicle came closer, the prophet could see on each structure 4 helicopter blades, 2 landing legs with round footpads, and 4 mechanical hands. Ezekiel then writes that he saw lightning darting back and forth among the 4 creatures. But perhaps what he really saw were control rockets being fired. Located on the inward side of each structure, they were used to position the craft for landing. After the vehicle had touched down, the prophet then spotted a large wheel by each of the structures. The 4 helicopter landing units were attached to the main stage of the spacecraft. Ezekiel depicts the hull as a firmament shining like crystal. This is a fairly accurate description of the mushroom-shaped metallic shell of the main body. On top of the main stage, the prophet sighted an astronaut that was wearing a gold-colored spacesuit. He spoke to Ezekiel as he sat in the pilot's seat of the transparent top stage of the vehicle, the command capsule. After the alien had delivered a short pronouncement, he then took the prophet by spaceship back to his people. Later in his book, Ezekiel tells us that he was transported by the space vehicle to Jerusalem. He was a witness to the examinations of its ungodly citizens. At the command of the spaceship pilot, 6 astronauts used unknown weapons to slay the people, all except the ones with X marked on their foreheads. Ezekiel was also a bystander in another operation performed by the spacemen. First, the command capsule was separated from the main body and moved, with the use of its rocket engine, to a safe location. Then an astronaut clothed in a white protective suit was ordered to station himself by one of the helicopter structures. Next, one of the mechanical arms reached out and removed some fiery material from the inside of the main stage. This matter was transferred into the hands of the spaceman with the protective suit. He took the mass, which was probably contaminated, and went out of the area, possibly to bury it. In the final step, the command capsule was returned to and recoupled to the top of the main configuration. In regards to the astronauts, in all biblical depictions, they were always portrayed as human beings. Accordingly, the space visitors must have been future Earthmen. The odds against alien beings having a close resemblance to Earth people would be astronomical. As for these spaceships, Blumrich believes that they were manufactured by a low space technology not far ahead of ours. If we take into account the distances between the stars and the overwhelming technological difficulties of interstellar travel, it seems highly unlikely that this hypothetical mothership of biblical vehicles would have been capable of propelling itself to Earth from another star system in our universe. Therefore, the spaceships must have come from a nearby planet in another universe. We can rule out an alien extra-dimensional world, as there is only a slight chance that it would have parallel geological, biological, and technological development. This leaves one remaining possibility. The vehicles originated on an identical Earth existing at a time period in the immediate future. Is there any evidence for this conclusion? We know that the biblical spacecrafts had two separately powered stages, like the American lunar modules, and that they were identified by the United States Space Engineer. Also, a crude model of the biblical craft has undergone successful testing at NASA's Langley Research Center, and Mr. Blumrich has secured a patent for the wheel system on the spaceship. These facts favor the theory that the space vehicles came from a future Earth, from our future. Surprisingly, this is not the only case in the Bible that can be interpreted as possible time travelers. Although Ezekiel is the most famous and well-known account, other writers, including John and Daniel, wrote accounts of angels that could be interpreted as time travelers. Some ufologists believe that Bible messengers that were perceived as angels are actually human time travelers who have come to warn the world. Due to their limited understanding, the writers misinterpreted these experiences. Furthermore, cultural and religious bias at the time encouraged writers to fit their accounts into their own preconceived ideas of God and angels. Over time, through translations, any ideas on time travel was lost, and accounts simply became the word of God. If the angels really were time travelers from the future, what did they have to say? When researching these ancient accounts, it appears 4 different types of incidents were told. Stories of historical wars, astronomical events, the discovery of codes in the Bible, and even of time travel encounters. Did these time travelers provide any other knowledge? In addition, there is the ancient Hebrew health code. Did time travelers gift Hebrew communities with their knowledge to help create healthier and more sanitary conditions? When thinking back to the past, specifically before the 19th century, it's expected that unsanitary conditions were commonplace. But curiously, this was not the case in the early Hebrew community. Medical officials were surprised to discover that the Israelites had reasonably modern health laws pertaining to body issues, leprosy, and circumcision, amongst other things. As modern medical science knows, many harmful bacteria can be transmitted by body discharges. In the past, knowing of this was lacking. Despite this, the Hebrews had many comprehensive regulations when dealing with this subject. For example, a person must have easement outside camp, and the excreta had to be buried. Individuals who came into contact with pathological discharges or other issues were considered unclean and were ordered to wash themselves and their clothes. Similar orders were also given with other conditions. When a person was found to have leprosy, they were expelled from the community. Once their quarantine ended, the infected person washed their body and garments, the scalp was shaved, and antiseptic was administered. How would the Hebrews have known to do all of these things? Although it is possible that all these health laws were given to the Hebrews by alien spacemen, it's more probable that they came from future Earthmen. Time travelers would be fully acquainted with our complex life forms, as well as the languages spoken on this planet. With more advanced knowledge from their own time, they could aid the Hebrews with creating more sanitary conditions. This may explain why the Hebrews appear to have knowledge ahead of their time. Did these ancient spacemen exist at all? Were they mistaken as God? Or were they actually of a completely different origin? From fulfilled prophecies to advanced health laws, could this really mean that these ancient spacemen were actually Earthlings from the future? The airship sightings of 1897 are arguably the first UFO wave in history, 50 years before the start of the modern UFO era. The wave itself actually began in November 1896, when mysterious airships were spotted flying against the wind over San Francisco. From there, they appeared to head steadily east, being spotted across California and into the states of the Midwest. By April of 1897, sightings were being made over Chicago, Illinois, and continued to be reported south of the Windy City over the coming days and weeks. However, when these strange vessels reached Texas, some of the most intriguing episodes of all unfolded. Just who might the crew of these bizarre aerial vehicles have been? Without a doubt, one of the most intriguing and detailed encounters on record during the wave of airship sightings was that of John Barclay in Texas. According to the account, which appeared in the Houston Post newspaper on the evening of April the 21st, 1897, John Barclay awoke to hear his dogs barking agitatedly outside. At the same time, he could hear a high-pitched whirring sound seemingly coming from above his house. He was more than shocked to see just one of those airships descending into a field a short distance from his house. He would later describe the airship as being a curious, oblong shape with wings and various unknown side attachments. He also recalled that there were several bright lights on board the vessel, lights that were much brighter than electric lights. He set out towards the craft, noting that the lights went out the closer he got to it. There was still enough light from the moon, however, for him to be able to see the vehicle clearly. Before he could reach it, though, as if out of nowhere, a man was suddenly standing in front of him. He assured him he would come to no harm and asked Barclay to lower his gun, which he duly did. After a moment or two, Barclay asked the stranger his name, to which he replied that it didn't matter about his name and that he could call him Smith. The man then proceeded to hand Barclay a crisp $10 note before asking if he could purchase lubricating oil, 2 chisels, and some bluestone from him. He offered that Barclay could keep the change for his assistance. Barclay agreed, but before going on his way, he asked the mysterious gentleman if he might be able to see the ship. To this the man declined, stating that he couldn't permit him to get any closer to it, although he didn't offer why. He did say, though, that they would return some future day and take him for a ride then. With that, Barclay went on his way to purchase the items he had been asked to obtain. He would return a short time later. He had managed to get chisels and oil, but was unable to find any bluestone. He offered the man the $10 back, but he was told he should keep it for his trouble, and the man thanked him for his efforts. With that, the man turned to head back to the waiting vehicle. When Barclay called out to him asking where he was from, he replied he was from anywhere, but that they would be in Greece the day after tomorrow. And with that, the object had disappeared, as if it had vanished into thin air like it had been shot out of a gun. Given the hints at being from another time, might we contemplate whether this mystery man meant Greece in April 1897 or Greece thousands of years in the past during its ancient civilization? By all accounts of those the reporter from the Houston Post spoke with, John Barclay was as an incredible witness as you could hope for, and certainly not someone to make up such an encounter. The Houston Post carried another very similar account several days later, this time a short distance away in Josserand. Frank Nichols was dragged out of his sleep the following evening on April the 22nd by a strange machine-type noise coming from outside his house. He could see an airship-type vehicle landing in one of his fields. He quickly made his way outside and towards the craft before two men appeared in front of him. Each of them was carrying a large bucket and asked if there was a well where they could obtain water. Nichols, also regarded as an honourable and credible witness, led them to one of his wells nearby. After they had filled the buckets with water, the two men invited Nichols to look at their vessel. He would later recall to the Houston Post that while they gave him a detailed explanation of how it worked, it was much too complicated and he couldn't understand most of what they were telling him. He did recall, though, that the vehicle ran on highly condensed electricity, and perhaps intriguingly, that this technology would soon be given to the wider public. These two strangers further informed Nichols that 5 of these vehicles had been built in the state of Iowa and were being tested as they used a newly discovered material. A similar encounter unfolded several weeks later in Hot Springs, Arkansas, on the rainy evening of May the 6th. On the night in question, Deputy Sheriff McLemore and Constable Sumter witnessed an approaching airship land near where they stood. They immediately made their way to where the object had descended to investigate further. When they were a short distance away, they called out to those on board, asking them to identify themselves. Out of the light of the vessel, a bearded man approached them. He was carrying a smaller light and replied to the officers that he and his passengers, another man and a woman, were travelling across the country in an airship. While the woman largely kept herself back in the shadows, the other man appeared to be filling something that appeared to be a sack with water. After several moments, the bearded man offered the two police officers a ride on the vehicle, claiming that they could take them where it wasn't raining. 2 officers, however, politely declined. Interestingly, McLemore would recall how the main light on the ship appeared to dim and brighten repeatedly. When we consider the fact that the Hot Springs area is a site of natural crystal, we might contemplate whether some kind of recharge operation was taking place between these crystal formations of the area and some kind of advanced technology on board. So who were these mysterious visitors who were seemingly traversing the United States in these mystery airships? While the sightings automatically fall into the UFO field of research, as Jacques Vallée commented in his book Dimensions, it is highly unlikely that the occupants of the airships were extraterrestrial in nature, not least as they looked exactly like any other American at the time and appeared familiar with and possessed American currency. Might these mysterious aerial travelers have been everyday American citizens who just happened to have been part of some kind of top-secret testing of a new flying vehicle? As tantalizing as the idea seems, it appears unlikely. Where, for example, was the great unveiling of such new aerial vehicles in the years that followed? If not aliens or engineers testing out an experimental machine, then might we consider that those on board these airships had arrived in America not from another country, but from another time? We might recall how the travellers John Barclay met claimed they had come from anywhere and would be in Greece the day after tomorrow. We perhaps should also consider the possibility that these travellers had not come from the future, but quite possibly from the past. After all, if we accept even the possibility that advanced civilizations existed in the distant past, who is to say that they might not have been developed and advanced enough to have been able to master time travel? Perhaps the occupants of the airships had arrived in, to them, the future from long before our own history. Like many such mysterious and curious encounters, there are many more questions than answers regarding the airship sightings of 1897. Including exactly where these strange ships and their occupants arrived from. Throughout time, there have been many intriguing time travel stories. One of the most puzzling accounts deals with a very brilliant Egyptologist, Joseph Bonomi, and a mysterious inventor named Samuel Alfred Warner. Between them, it is rumored they designed and built a real time machine based on secret ancient Egyptian knowledge. Hiding deep within the grounds and shrouded by trees stands a foreboding mausoleum, an imposing 20-foot tall with a pyramid roof. It's made from granite, with a solid, heavy bronze door secured by a keyhole. Decorative accents line the door, furthering the air of mystery. The door's margin displays a rectangular strip of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Built in the early 1850s, it was intended as the final resting place of a woman named Hannah Cautley and two of her three daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Very little is known about Hannah Cautley or about her three daughters, Elizabeth and Mary Ann. But for the last 150 years, they've been at eternal rest in a mausoleum at Brompton Cemetery, West London. During her lifetime, she'd amassed a fortune. Some said she'd been the mistress of kings, politicians, and rich, powerful men. No one knows who fathered her two daughters, but they died soon after their mother, and nobody knows how they died. More mysterious still is the mausoleum, standing 20 feet tall in the middle of Brompton Cemetery, and rumoured to be a time machine. It is rumoured that Bonamy designed Hannah's mausoleum, a theory given some credence by its pyramid-shaped peak and by the mysterious hieroglyphics inscribed on the walls of the tomb and on Bonamy's own headstone. The Victorians were fascinated with the idea of time travel, and some believed the pharaohs had discovered its secrets. Might Bonamy have learned the time travel trick during one of his expeditions to the pyramids? Gently opening the old iron gate of Brompton Cemetery is somewhat similar to breaking the spine of a book containing some secret London history. Well-known suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst was laid to rest here. Beatrix Potter also walked its many plots of land and penned names from gravestones to use in her work, these including decedents Peter Rabbit and Mr. Nutkins. In excess of 35,000 landmarks in all are available, rich and poor, known and forgotten. Hannah Cautley's tomb would be impressive for its imposing stature and cryptic veneer alone. It's the largest, most elaborate construction in all of Brompton Cemetery. But there's more to this story, much more, that it's secretly a time machine. London musician and Cautley historian Stephen Coates, the man behind some of the recent bizarre claims, states it's not a time machine, it's a teleportation chamber. In order to try and interpret the bizarre urban legend that's been constructed around Cautley's tomb, it helps to understand the complex and secretive life of the woman who ordered its construction. Born around 1784, Hannah Peters fled an abusive father at a young age and found work as a housekeeper and as a tavern employee. In 1800, a friend introduced her to John Cautley, a 70-year-old former wig maker in poor health who had made a fortune in the early banking business. Peters was shortly in his employ as a housekeeper. Within the year, she had given birth to the first of three daughters. She claimed they were indeed Cautley's despite his age, although some suspected and made it known they believed that the friend who made the introduction, Francis Grosso, might have been the real father. John Cautley's illness is also ill-defined in historical accounts. Although it was rumoured he had a violent run-in with a street worker in 1795 that left Cautley, who had been attacked with a knife, reserved and antisocial. He fell in love with a young Hannah, who took his name and had considerable influence over many of his decisions. Cautley's 1810 will, which initially left most of his fortune to an ex-wife named Mary Ann Woolley and their 5 children, was changed in 1814, so Hannah received the majority of his wealth. Like many Victorians of the time, Hannah was intrigued by Egyptian iconography, particularly hieroglyphics. She believed the Egyptians had a deep understanding of astrology and of their place in the universe, and she invited Egyptologist Joseph Bonamy over to her home for regular visits. Bonamy and Hannah would spend hours discussing Egyptian lore, with Hannah hoping to one day fund Bonamy's expeditions to Egypt so he could further their studies. When Hannah passed away in 1849, she was laid to rest in an expensive, elaborately designed mausoleum in Brompton that paid tribute to her interests. Bonamy arranged for the tomb to feature Egyptian characters and a pyramidal top. Later, Mary and Elizabeth, who never married for fear of losing their wealth to untrustworthy men, joined her. Susanna, her third daughter who married, was buried elsewhere. When Bonamy died in 1878, he arranged for a depiction of Cautley's tomb to appear on his own modest headstone. Whether Bonamy intended it or not, an illustration of Anubis, the Egyptian god of the dead, appears to be looking in the direction of his friend's final resting place. Things appeared to be normal at Brompton for the next 100 years or so. Then, around 1980, the key to the tomb was lost, following a visit by Hannah's relatives, and that's when things took a turn for the weird. It was reporter Helen Smith who unsuspectingly wrote an article in 1998. That article may have been the first mainstream story to raise the theory that Cautley's tomb might actually be a time machine. She described the monument as a strange, imposing structure containing 3 spinsters, about whom almost nothing is known, and cited an unheralded author named Howard Webster as perpetrator of the story. Webster claimed his research had excavated a connection between Bonamy and Samuel Alfred Warner, a maverick Victorian genius and fraudster said to have attempted to interest the British Armed Forces in several advanced weapons, too advanced, in fact, to actually exist. Webster thought that Warner's inventive genius may have led him to team up with Bonamy, who supposedly had knowledge of the Egyptian theories of time travel. Together, the two persuaded the wealthy, trusting Hannah to finance their secret project, with Bonamy providing ancient wisdom and Warner adding his breakthrough scientific resources. By strategically placing their device in a cemetery, Warner could guarantee the structure was unlikely to be disturbed over decades or centuries, allowing him to return to London after travelling through time again and again. The fact that the key was missing was pivotal to Webster's tale. Since it had been lost and no one had opened the mausoleum for years, could it be perhaps that Warner was busying himself in a manner similar to an occupant of the TARDIS, travelling from era to era, while Hannah and her family were either entombed or buried someplace else entirely? Webster also claimed that the blueprints for the tomb were missing, which was very unusual for monuments in Brompton. The story slowly gathered momentum over the years. In 2003, an album cover by musician Drew Mulholland illustrated Hannah's tomb and its mysterious construction. This too helped pique the public's interest. In 2011, Coates, a musician with a band named The Real Tuesday Weld, read about Hannah's alleged time machine and became intrigued. He wrote an article on his blog postulating that the Cautley tomb was not a means of time travel, but that Warner had the technology to teleport torpedoes, and that he later adopted the framework to develop a series of teleportation chambers in and around the Magnificent Seven, a group of London's historic private cemeteries. It was a way to move around the city, Coates says. Warner and Bonamy worked together on an ancient Egyptian occult theory and science. I posted that on my blog, and it started to take on a life of its own, he said. Coates' premise is a proper study in how an urban legend can proliferate. With the key still missing, it was impossible to disprove the teleportation idea with any real precision, and the mythology allowed for a great deal of speculation. Why did the tomb take 4 years to complete following Hannah's death, which meant she didn't actually enter it until 1853? Was Hannah fooled by the two to fund what she believed would be a time machine? It can be difficult to corner Coates for a precise answer on whether he believes his fanciful hypothesis about the resting place of Hannah Cautley. When initially contacted by the Floss online magazine for an interview, he agreed while mentioning that he came up with the whole teleportation system idea as the background to a short story. In conversation, he presents the teleportation springboard as a way for people to make up their own mind about what the tomb might contain. A breath or two later, he expresses doubt that Hannah's daughters might still be entombed there, before wondering whether the mausoleum might be home to a secret subterranean chamber. It's all alternative theory based on historical fact, he says. Opening it may not establish it's not a time machine, Coates hedges. It may just deepen the mystery. For many, the tomb is a slab of rock. The real magic is in their minds. Ursula Sundial, better known as Mother Shipton, was a 14th century English prophet and visionary who, in her lifetime, foretold of many great things that were to come, things that no one could have ever known unless they truly had been given a glimpse into the future. But how did this prophet receive these amazing revelations? Was she chosen by a higher intelligence to share truths from the future? Or was she part of a great plan that had been repeating throughout history? There have been many prophets throughout history, biblical prophets, Moses and Aeschyle, to Nostradamus, considered by some as the greatest prophet. But what of Ursula Sundial? Many of Ursula's prophecies and visions did not become known to the world until the year of 1681, over 80 years after her death. Yet, ever since that time, the wisdom contained in her words has continued to intrigue all who have read them. From its earliest beginnings, Ursula's life was traumatic. She was the daughter of Agatha, a young girl who became pregnant at only 15 years of age. It is said that when Agatha refused to tell who the father of her baby was, she was treated as an outcast and forced to live in a cave on the outskirts of Knaresborough, England. It was in the darkness of that cave, below Knaresborough Castle, that Ursula's life began. On a night filled with thunder and lightning in 1488, Agatha gave birth to a little girl who would one day give the world prophecies of the future, revelations that still shock and amaze. The woman who delivered Ursula into the world spoke of a smell of sulphur and of hearing a great crack of thunder as the child was born. The little that is known about Ursula's early life describes a child who had to walk with a stick because her back was bent and her legs were bowed and twisted. Yet these afflictions did not deter Ursula Sundial, and from her earliest beginnings, people realized that she was different in more ways than just her appearance. At the age of 24, Ursula married a carpenter from York called Tobias Shipton, but her husband died 2 years later, leaving her alone and without any means of support. After the death of her husband, Ursula went back to live in the cave where she was born. She survived by telling fortunes and giving visions of things to come. Ursula did not become known as Mother Shipton until the latter part of her life. By that time, her gift of visions and prophecies were known throughout the land. Even Henry VIII, King of England, sent messages from London to hear her prophecies. Mother Shipton told the world many things in her lifetime, things that would later come true with frightening accuracy. She foretold the horrors of the Black Death of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666, prophecies that did not come to pass until long after her death in 1561. Many of Mother Shipton's prophecies were spoken in a series of rhymed couplets, poetic verse that vividly describes monumental moments in history. Great minds have studied the words she left behind, interpreting the meanings of the woman who truly did see the future. Many of the lines from her poetic prophecies reflect the world in which we live today. She was no doubt speaking about things of the modern world. However, Mother Shipton described them hundreds of years before they ever existed. Her words, and now a word in uncouth rhyme, of what shall be in future time. Future time? How more direct could Mother Shipton have been? And what would the world have looked like through the eyes of someone who lived hundreds of years before us, unless they fully understood what they were seeing? Do we just accept that everything was coincidence? Or should we ask how she knew that one day people all over the world would drive cars and travel through the sky in vehicles? Could she have been a time traveler, a walk-in, or even an alien being placed upon the earth to sow the seeds of the future? Her words, "A carriage without horse will go, disaster fill the world with woe," tells us something unimaginable to the people of her time, but was Mother Shipton referring to a motor vehicle when she wrote that first line? "Through towering hills proud men shall ride, no horse or ass move by his side." It's amazing how clear the message seems to be to anyone reading it now. But how could she have known? The truth is, she couldn't have known, unless the visions were planted in her mind by a higher intelligence, or Mother Shipton and other great prophets throughout history really were visitors from the future. It was something no one could have ever known about unless they had seen such things. And the only words she could use to describe what she saw in the vision were the simple words spoken by the people of that time. To have said anything more would have been beyond their understanding. Yet, Mother Shipton's prophecies clearly tell people of the future exactly what she was saying. To have seen the things she describes hundreds of years before they existed must have been like viewing magic, unless the prophets were part of a great plan to educate humanity of things to come. Does her rhyme of future time go on to reveal the knowledge of the internet? Around the world men's thoughts will fly, quick as the twinkling of an eye. Another rhyme that must have meant very little when it was first spoken, but today the meaning of those words can be understood. They were the prophet's interpretation of the World Wide Web and all things connected to the unseen communications of our modern world, the telephone, radio, and even the television. A skeptic might interpret such words and their meanings in other ways, but we wonder how they would explain Mother Shipton's vision of iron on water. In water, iron then shall float, as easy as a wooden boat. She was without doubt telling the world about ships of the future, ships made of iron, vessels that no one from her time would have ever dreamed could float. The reason why she was given the gift of visions will never be known. Some of the rhymes appear to be warnings for humanity, while others contain seeds of wisdom, enabling great minds to create the inventions of the future, such as boats made of iron. The prophet who lived in the darkness of a cave spoke of things that could not have existed anywhere else, except in the modern age: machinery, agriculture, and man's ability to master the oceans and the air. Her words, "and roaring monsters with a man atop, does seem to eat the verdant crop, and men shall fly as birds do now, and give away the horse and plough." What had she seen, and what was she trying to tell us? A roaring monster with a man atop? If that line was said alone, it would not make sense to anyone. What else could she have been describing but a combine harvester? And men shall fly as birds do now, and give away the horse and plough. Was she foretelling the invention of aircraft, our ability to move from the land into the air, and the expansion of civilizations as we know it today? The last of Mother Shipton's prophecies are perhaps the most chilling, not least because she tells of catastrophic events, some that have already come to pass, momentous events that are documented in history. Her words: "In 1926, build houses light of straw and sticks, for then shall mighty wars be planned, and fire and sword shall sweep the land." Were we being given a horrifying glimpse of the coming of war? The vision continues with more vivid descriptions of foretelling doom when she says, "When pictures seem alive with movements free, when boats like fishes swim beneath the sea, when men like birds shall scour the sky, then half the world, deep drenched in blood, shall die." Did she foresee the end of humankind, or were her words the beginning of that end, and all part of the grand design? Great minds have pored over the prophecies of Mother Shipton and their potential meanings. What could we learn when she says, "When north shall thus divide the south, and eagle build in lion's mouth"? Upon reading those two lines, we immediately think of the words spoken by the great prophet Cautley when he foretold of his vision of God. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man. Each of the four had the face of a lion on the right side, each of the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and each of the four had the face of an eagle. Thus were their faces. Both of these great prophets were trying to describe something that came from the future. Perhaps they had encounters with extraterrestrials, or they were themselves advanced beings and knew much more than they could ever have told the world. Clearly something beyond our understanding was influencing them. Mother Shipton left us so much to think about, only using the tools that she had at her disposal, words from the past. But those words were not by a wordsmith whose sole invention was to deceive. To avoid being accused of witchcraft, Mother Shipton foretold her visions of future time in poetic rhyme. To have delivered her prophecies in any other way would have sealed her fate. In 1559, 2 years before she died, Mother Shipton left her most chilling warnings to mankind when she wrote, "For storms will rage and oceans roar when Gabriel stands on sea and shore, and as he blows his wondrous horn, old worlds die and new be born." Will this become the most telling, unfulfilled prophecy ever known to man? Was Mother Shipton describing the events written in Revelations, the last trumpet sounding the end of humanity and the birth of a new world? The Archangel Gabriel is known as the Angel of Revelation. It's possible that beings from the heavens were giving her visions, and that they were the same beings that Ezekiel saw in his vision of God. It appears all the great prophets and visionaries throughout history may have advanced mankind. After all, people like Nikola Tesla also claim to have been given inspiration in his inventions. But in regards to much prophesied end times, is anyone today still listening? Beginning in October 1939, the residents of Provincetown, Massachusetts, began hearing of bizarre and unsettling encounters experienced by the children of the town. All of the tales were the same. A tall, dark figure dressed entirely in black would leap out at the children before disappearing again into the night. Perhaps most unsettling of all were the menacing figure's glowing red eyes. To begin with, the townsfolk put the children's tales down to a combination of imagination, a mild case of hysteria, and the fact that Halloween was just around the corner. However, when a young woman came forward saying that she too had seen the bizarre figure, the sightings were treated a lot more seriously. This unsettling creature began to be referred to as the Black Flash, and for a time, the sightings and encounters with it gripped the entire community. It was during one late October evening when a local resident, Mary Costa, was making her way through the town. Now the summer tourists had gone, the area was a lot quieter and much more peaceful at night. However, that peacefulness was about to be swept away. Out of the corner of her eye, Mary noticed a shape leap out of the nearby bushes. By the time she had focused her attention on the figure, she realized it stood at least 8 feet tall, had glowing eyes and pointed silver ears. This disturbing figure stared at Mary for several moments before leaping high into the air, jumping and springing from walls and buildings until it was out of sight. She would run to a coffee shop a little way ahead whose light was one of the few on in the street. She told those inside what she'd seen, and despite several of the customers doing a search of the immediate vicinity, there was nothing to be found of the mysterious figure. She made a report to the police a short time later, and while they did indeed record the incident, they didn't take it too seriously. However, Mary's would be just the first of many reports to reach Provincetown law enforcement. Almost all of these reports were identical in detail. All mentioned a tall figure dressed in black, with some witnesses recalling seeing a cape. All claimed the figure had bizarre pointed ears and eyes that glowed. Some would even state these were blue, while others reported seeing red eyes. Even stranger, the figure's presence was usually accompanied by a strange buzzing sound, like that of a fly or a bee. And of course, almost against the laws of physics, the figure could jump high into the air and leap great distances. As if to make the police's job even more difficult, who were already struggling to keep up with the surge of sightings of the mystery menace, reports would often come in from 2 different locations at the same time. This suggested to them that this creature, whatever it was, could either move at exceptional speeds or there was more than one black flash. The vast majority of the encounters were also almost identical. This curious creature would leap out at people when they least suspected it, stare at them for several moments before disappearing out of sight, usually taking long leaps and jumps. However, some incidences were a little more intense than others. For example, one witness, Charles Farley, claimed to have fired his gun at the obscure creature, and what's more, he stated that he'd hit it. However, rather than fall to the floor, the figure simply laughed and then leapt over a particularly high fence and disappeared. Another witness, who remained anonymous, claimed that he was backed into a corner by the figure and so had no option but to throw a punch at it. When he did, though, the tall brute caught his fist in mid-air before crushing it in its grip, forcing the witness to the ground in pain. Before it disappeared, the witness saw bizarre blue flames coming out of its mouth. In fact, this detail about the blue flames emerging from the figure's mouth is particularly intriguing. It's hard to examine these enthralling, if strange, tales of the Black Flash of Provincetown without looking at the similarities to Spring-Heeled Jack, an almost identical assailant who terrified Victorian England for much of the 19th century. Aside from similarities in dress, Spring-Heeled Jack, as his moniker would suggest, had the ability to leap over tall walls and even buildings. What's more, many witnesses claim to have seen blue flames emerge from his mouth. Were these two creatures, separated by location and time, one and the same? Or might they perhaps be two different people but connected by the same secret technology? And if so, where is the technology now? Positioned near the northeastern coast of the United States and still feeling the effects of the Great Depression, the region's fishermen would tell of witnessing German submarines off the Atlantic coast, an obvious sign to them and many others throughout the United States that America would likely end up becoming involved in another war in Europe, despite the promises to the contrary of President Franklin Roosevelt. In the opening weeks of 1939, in the Wood End region of Provincetown, a bizarre sea monster would wash up on the shore. Rumours circled that this was the legendary sea beast that had been sighted by George Reedy almost half a century earlier in 1886, although it was later discovered to be nothing more but a decomposing basking shark. However, as bizarre as it might sound, it would seem these incidents almost set a subconscious tone throughout Provincetown for the final year of the 1930s, and this shows in the most bizarre ways. For example, according to an annual police report, and something that had not been adequately explained, records of people being bitten by dogs and cats in 1939 in the area is the highest on record, with no build-ups before or steady decline after. Simply a spike in these attacks on people by otherwise friendly pets. Even more concerning, and again with no obvious reason why, a sudden surge of arson attacks plagued the town throughout the month of September, just before the sightings of the Black Flash began. While many consider the Black Flash sightings unexplained and unresolved, the Chief of Police, Anthony Tarvers, believed he knew who was behind the encounters. According to his investigation, the Black Flash was actually the work of 4 local teenage boys whose reason was nothing more than to pull a prank on the general public. He claimed the 4 boys would split into 2 pairs and then, having one stand on the other, and disguise themselves as being around 8 foot tall. What's more, he claimed to have discovered the identity of one of the boys involved, and although he didn't name the person, he claimed in a public police statement that he would be speaking to the boy concerned and his family. Whether he did so or not remains unknown, but shortly after this public statement, the Black Flash sighting stopped. To some, though, regardless of the reasons why the sighting ceased, Tarver's explanation simply didn't hold water. Even assuming that the boys did manage to give the impression that they were an 8-foot-tall adult figure by simply standing on each other's shoulders, how were they able to execute such mammoth leaps, as reported by multiple people around the town? What's more, how could they withstand a bullet from close range, and how did they summon the strength to almost crush a grown man's hand? It's also important to mention that according to some researchers, the sightings didn't cease after only a few weeks in 1939, but continued, albeit sporadically, until late 1945, after the end of the Second World War. Whether this is true or not is open to debate. Might it be the case that Tarvers simply wanted to give the impression that the sightings had stopped before the town descended into hysteria? And if this was the case, were sightings largely suppressed as much as possible following this? And just who or what was the Black Flash of Provincetown? Was it some kind of cryptid creature unknown to science, or perhaps an extraterrestrial who seemingly disappeared into legend as quickly as it had emerged? Or should the connections to Spring-Heeled Jack from the previous century be examined further? Perhaps both entities were merely humans with some kind of advanced technical clothing that gave such powers as their ability to leap over tall walls and buildings, and to withstand bullet shots and physical assaults. The fact is, we're no closer to solving the mysterious Black Flash sightings today in the 21st century than we were when they happened in 1939. For now at least, all possibilities remain on the table and the search for the identity of the Black Flash of Provincetown continues.
In recent years, special access programs developed under the United States government have documented their current research topics, one of which has received significant funding. The study in wormholes is a very real thing, and certainly backed up with some evidence. NASA have also revealed a study into portals, which they have stated are large and sustained. Could it be that such authorities have finally stumbled onto these invisible doorways to other locations? And if so, how long have such things been around? Could such a new discovery account for some of the strangest incidents on planet Earth? Many psychic researchers who are investigating this enigma are convinced that this planet of ours holds many secrets which are constantly being probed. Indeed, these invisible windows through which individuals have taken a journey to the past is only one of many mysteries of planet Earth.
The Alaska Triangle is one of the most mysterious stretches of land on the planet. Home to numerous paranormal encounters, including sightings of UFOs and strange beasts, it's also a place where multiple people have simply vanished into thin air. One of the earliest such mysterious disappearances, at least in the modern era, occurred on January the 26th, 1950, when a Douglas C-54D Skymaster disappeared along with the 8 crew and 38 passengers on board while flying over Alaska on its way to Montana. The flight was scheduled to last 8 hours. However, after only 2 hours in the air, all radio contact with the plane suddenly ceased. There was no distress call or any other indication that there was anything wrong. Both the American and Canadian militaries took part in an extensive search of the area, but no sign of the plane or those on board was ever found. Officially, the plane and her crew remain missing. Just over 2 decades later, on October the 16th, 1972, politician Hale Boggs disappeared along with 3 other people when the plane they were travelling across Alaska in simply vanished. A huge search, which lasted over a month and involved the United States Coast Guard, the military, and civilian aircraft, was put into action, but neither the plane or the 4 people on board, including Boggs, were ever found. Interestingly or not, Boggs was a member of the Warren Commission that had been set up to investigate the assassination of former President John Kennedy, leading some to question just what did happen during that fateful flight, perhaps not least as the plane wasn't carrying an emergency locator transmitter, something which Alaskan law required of every aircraft. Following a July the 4th parade in 1995 in Fairbanks, 73-year-old Leonard Lane, a veteran of the Second World War, seemingly disappeared off the face of the planet. He was last seen in the evening as he prepared to take a walk in the woods that were within the boundaries of the Alaska Triangle. There were several people who saw him venture off, as he was identifiable by the fact he walked with a notable limp, the result of an injury from the war. From that point on, however, there are no clues whatsoever as to exactly where he went, what route he took, or ultimately what happened to him. It appears as though he quite literally vanished into thin air. Although he was declared legally dead 2 years later in 1997, he remains missing, and the details of his disappearance remain a complete mystery. When nurse Thomas Anthony Nunees failed to show for work one day in 2001, his concerned employers reported him missing. He had been staying at a Super 8 motel in Anchorage at the time of his disappearance. The previous evening, several people recalled seeing him at a local gas station where he purchased cigarettes and refreshments. He was also with an unidentified woman at the time. The case took a rather ominous turn, however, when staff at the motel also reported seeing the woman in Nunees' room on the night he disappeared, although she appeared to be with another man at the time, whose identity also remains unknown. Did Nunees disappear while travelling to work, or might these mystery individuals know more about his whereabouts and his fate? The case remains unsolved. 5 years later, in the summer of 2006, near the small town of McCarthy, near the St. Elias National Park, Richard Lyman Griffiths ventured into the wilderness of the Alaska Triangle and was never seen again. He was, most people assumed, performing tests on his invention, a wilderness survival cocoon. However, after several months had gone by, search efforts got underway to locate him. Authorities did manage to track his initial movements. It appeared he had taken a bus along the Alaska Highway before departing and checking into a small lodge near the White River. It's from here where he travelled to McCarthy on a camping vacation before venturing off into the hills with his survival cocoon. No signs of Richard Griffiths or the equipment he took with him have ever been located. The disappearance of 65-year-old Paul Michael Lemaitre is particularly intriguing, given that he was competing in a marathon with many people around him at the time of his perplexing departure. The last reported sighting of him was around 200 feet from the finish line of the race, when a race steward saw him and asked his race number. Lemaitre responded, which demonstrated that he was of sound mind and aware following the grueling task. However, when he failed to show at the finish line, race organisers and local authorities immediately set out searching for him. There was, though, no sign of the missing runner whatsoever, and even trained police search dogs could offer no clues as to which way he might have gone. Experienced pilot Alan Foster remains missing after disappearing on the afternoon of September the 9th, 2013, while flying his Piper PA aircraft over the Alaska Triangle. The flight appeared to be uneventful to begin with. However, around 20 minutes after refueling at Yakutat, the control tower noted that he had suddenly descended to just over 1,000 feet. A short time later, all communications ceased. Despite searches taking place almost immediately, there was no sign of the aircraft or Alan Foster, leaving all involved particularly perplexed. Foster was an experienced pilot with almost 10,000 of flight time under his belt. Had he been in trouble, he would have reported it to the tower, but no such reports were issued, and it was thought he and his plane were there 1 minute and gone the next. Just over a year later, on October the 11th, 2014, Yaltiara Hamblin was reported missing by her concerned roommate in Anchorage, and when investigators put together her last known movements, things didn't look at all hopeful. The previous evening, Jal had dinner with her roommate, Kendra Estrada. By the time they had eaten, it was almost 10 p.m, and Kendra went to bed. Jal, on the other hand, claimed she was headed out to the Trailside Loop area. It came to light that she could have met up with an unnamed man who she had recently arranged a date with following the breakdown of her relationship with her boyfriend. When Kendra called her roommate the following morning, several times without the phone being answered, she notified the authorities. Her disappearance remains completely unexplained. More recently, at around noon on June the 3rd, 2019, Shanna Oman set off for her home after visiting her friends in Fairbanks. Her friend had driven her to the Nico River, which was a short distance from her house. However, it was the last known sighting of Shana, who seemingly disappeared a short time later. Later that evening, Shana's roommate called the friend Shana had visited to see if she was still there, as she had not returned home. The two women immediately raised the alarm, but not only were the authorities unable to locate the missing woman, but there were no clues whatsoever of where she had gone and what had happened to her. She remains missing. The following year, on August 17th, 2020, experienced outdoorsman Frank Minano seemingly disappeared without a trace, also in Fairbanks, in circumstances that offer no real clue as to what had happened. It appeared that he had stayed in a cabin on the day of the last sighting of him, with authorities believing he was planning to head back to Nenana. His vehicle was found near the highway between Fairbanks and Nenana, and they believe he had left the vehicle in order to collect firewood. However, from there, the case goes instantly cold. There were no sightings of Minano leaving the vehicle or of being in the area, and it's not known exactly where he was planning on going after bringing his vehicle to a stop. He's just one of many thousands of people who are potential victims of the Alaska Triangle. Occultist Aleister Crowley was undoubtedly one of the most notorious, controversial, and respected men of his era, all in equal measure. A person who captivated many with his writings and enchanting personality, and who was prepared to seek out knowledge of all kinds throughout his rich and experienced life. He was also, and continues to be, at the center of a storm that argues that one of his occult rituals, or more specifically, an attempted reproduction of it by two of his followers just before his death, resulted in a wave of UFO sightings and alien abductions that would begin shortly after. Was a portal opened using ancient rituals that led to these strange crafts and unsettling entities entering into our world? Crowley had claimed to have communicated with entities from other realms on several previous occasions. In Shanghai in 1906, for example, he would attempt to summon his holy guardian angel, Iwas, and would do so with the assistance of Elaine Simpson, another renowned occultist and medium, and a person who it is claimed Crowley had contacted through astral means, literally psychic meetings, on several occasions. On April the 20th, 1906, in Simpson's temple, he seemingly succeeded in this communication, writing years later that his guide appeared from an astral plane, enveloped in a fantastic blue and carrying a strange wand. It is said that during this appearance, Simpson offered to Crowley that this spirit had followed him for some time. Without a doubt, though, the most intriguing and perhaps unsettling sessions occurred between January and March 1918 in the furnished rooms of the Central Park West Hotel in New York. The sessions themselves are referred to as the Alamantra working, and featured Crowley using ancient incantations that would ultimately open a portal to another realm of existence. From this portal, an entity known as Lamb would communicate directly with him. Crowley would produce a detailed sketch of this creature, a sketch that Crowley claimed he produced while looking at the entity in the flesh, and it is a picture that is one of the most thought-provoking pieces of artwork in recent history. Even the most skeptical of people would have to admit, retrospectively years later, that its appearance was remarkably similar to how we perceive grey aliens to be in our modern world. And we should remember that this sketch was produced almost 30 years before the Roswell crash and the start of the modern UFO era, and almost half a century before this perception really took hold in the public consciousness. How could it be that Crowley produced such an image that most of us would instantly recognize as a grey alien so long before such a depiction was a part of our collective reality? Might the interdimensional creature, Lamb, that Crowley was communicating with be what we would call a grey alien today? And might this offer clues as to the true nature of these apparent extraterrestrials? In the decades that followed, a cult of sorts named the Cult of Lamb grew out of Crowley's followers around these interdimensional communication sessions. Many of Crowley's subsequent followers would attempt their own communication with this entity from another dimension. And over the course of these communication attempts, Lamb was considered to be a race of entity as opposed to an individual being. Could this be true? Is Lamb not simply a sole entity, but a race of entities from another world? And might we know these entities as grey aliens today? Is this a case of modern folklore being written in real time, or might this knowledge be the result of continued communication between these interdimensional beings and Crowley's followers? Unfortunately, Crowley himself would not elaborate on what was spoken of between himself and Lamb during these communication sessions. They remain, however, some of the most intriguing events on record, especially when we turn our attention to two of Crowley's followers who would attempt their own communication sessions just short of 20 years later. In January 1946 in Pasadena, California, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard would proceed with their own rituals in an attempt to recreate those of Crowley's in the Central Park West Hotel. And according to their own writings, these rituals were a success, and they did indeed manage to open a portal. It is perhaps interesting to note that both men would go on to have successful, if extremely different lives following these sessions. Parsons would start what would become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, an organization at the cutting edge of technology, not least space travel technology. Hubbard, on the other hand, would begin the Scientology movement. Many have pondered whether the inspiration, influence, and subsequent success of both men in their endeavors is because of their communication with entities from other worlds during these sessions in the mid-1940s. To some, though, the topic of debate was not whether the amateur occultists had managed to open a portal with which to communicate with interdimensional beings, but whether they had managed to close it correctly or not. And according to some researchers, they didn't. And this failure to securely close the portal allowed permanent access to our world to those who resided in this other realm. Might this apparent failure to close the portal they had seemingly opened have resulted in all manner of entities and their flying craft coming into our world? Is it merely a coincidence that the UFO sightings began, many of them in the United States, in the years immediately following these sessions? Admittedly, this is pure speculation, but intriguing speculation nonetheless. Especially when we remind ourselves once again of the sketch of Lamb and how similar it was to a grey alien being. It's also interesting to note that the location of the Roswell crash in Roswell, New Mexico, sits along the 33rd parallel, a line of latitude that has numerous paranormal encounters associated with it. The location of the ritual sessions performed by Parsons and Hubbard in Pasadena resides close to that, just off the 34th parallel. If this portal was left open by Parsons and Hubbard, does it remain open today? If this is the case, is there anyone so adept at occult knowledge as Aleister Crowley undoubtedly was that able to close it? And might this open portal explain a plethora of UFO sightings, as well as encounters with alien entities and even Bigfoot creatures that have swept through the United States and indeed the world since the late 1940s. And as well as the Roswell crash along this line of latitude, several other claims of downed UFOs exist here also. Might this apparent open gateway be to blame? If there is a connection between these portals that has apparently been opened by Crowley and then his followers after him, as well as the being or beings known as Lamb, then what does that say about the many UFO and alien encounters, and indeed about UFOs and aliens in general? Are these entities not visiting us from different planets, but also from a different dimension? One only those adept in occultism know how to access. And might what we perceive as extraterrestrials from another world actually be entities from another dimension, one that runs alongside our own in ways that we are yet to fully understand? Taking these thoughts a stage further, where might the alien abduction phenomena fit into all of this? Why would creatures from another dimension who have only gained access to our world through ancient occult rituals suddenly begin systematically abducting members of the human population and then performing all manner of procedures and experiments on them? Might we consider that these interdimensional creatures require a physical body to exist in our world, much like many ancient writings state about such entity as the Watchers or other angels? And might the proposed hybridization theories put forward by some researchers not be one of a human-alien combination, but a human interdimensional being one? And could their presence on Earth go back decades, only now they have regained access to our world from a realm they were banished to thousands of years ago? As preposterous as it might seem to many, there is little reason to doubt the authenticity of Crowley's claims and accounts. For all his sensationalism, the very fact he refused to speak widely of the communication sessions in that New York hotel room should perhaps alert us to the fact that something very profound and possibly life-changing was relayed to the occultist during the opening months of 1918. Indeed, those rituals, and perhaps more specifically the attempts to replicate them by Crowley's followers, might very well prove to be life-changing for all of us. Did a father and son travel to another dimension while driving home one evening, or were they abducted by extraterrestrials from another world? What follows is an incident that is as thought-provoking and intriguing as it is bizarre and mind-bending. The enthralling encounter began at around 9 p.m. on July 6, 1978, when 66-year-old Francisco Nunees and his 23-year-old son Carmelo, both mechanics, were driving back to Mendoza in Argentina following a business meeting in Maupu. They were traveling in a 1933 American Chrysler, a car that Carmelo had recently restored for his father, so it looked and ran as if they had just picked it up straight from the production line, with the bonus that it had all the mod cons of a vehicle made in the 1970s. The road they were driving was quiet, and the journey had so far been pleasant and uneventful. That was until Carmelo turned the car onto an expressway ramp. Almost immediately after doing so, a green pickup truck appeared behind him as if out of nowhere. After several seconds, the truck passed them. However, as soon as it had, it pulled in front of them and began slowing down. Much to Carmelo's confusion, they too were slowing their speed, in spite of the fact that his foot remained pressed down on the accelerator. He continued forward as fast as the strange circumstances would allow. Then the truck disappeared right before their eyes, as did the entire road. At this point, both men were more than confused. They could sense the car was still moving forward, only all around them was complete darkness. Even the vehicle's headlights, which were on full beam, stretched out into total blackness. They continued on for several minutes, trying to reassure themselves that they had taken a wrong turn somewhere. As they were contemplating this, the darkness morphed into a strange, futuristic-looking city. They were moving at a considerable pace, so fast in fact that the tall buildings flew past them. Despite this pace, though, they could still see clearly the magnificent height of these mammoth structures. Each of them started directly from the road and then went directly vertical upwards, so far that they couldn't see the top of them. Each also had a strange red glow that came from the inside, a glow that they appeared to disappear into overhead. The lights lit up the entire city, which comprised of no other constructs or signage, and made them realize that the sky was not sky, but in fact some kind of ceiling. For the first time since this obscure ordeal had begun, they began to wonder if the road they'd been traveling on had not disappeared, but if they had vanished and gone elsewhere. Maybe, they wondered, they were in some kind of domed spacecraft. As they were contemplating this, their car, seemingly under the control of someone or something else, turned, even though the steering wheel remained locked in position, and began down a side road to these mammoth-like buildings. Carmelo would later recall that it felt as though the car was floating in the air as opposed to moving along a road. It was as they made this turn that both men noticed the faint sound of strange music all around them. They continued down the side road for around 15 minutes. Then, as quickly as they entered these curious surroundings, they suddenly found themselves back on a street near their home. Carmelo would calmly take control of the car, and the men made the rest of the journey in silence. As soon as they walked through the door, Francisco's mother questioned where they had been, telling them several times how late it was. To this question, Carmelo almost cryptically replied that they'd been to a place where nobody goes. In the days that followed, both men preferred not to speak of the strange encounter, instead attempting to carry on as normal, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Then, around 3 weeks after that unsettling night, Francisco had a sudden and bizarre moment of recall. He would suddenly declare to his family that although he wasn't sure where he and Carmelo went to that evening, he was certain that they were not on Earth. The account would eventually leak out into the local community and ultimately would come to the attention of National Enquirer journalist Bob Pratt. He would interview the father and son and convince them to undergo hypnotic regression in order to reveal just what had taken place that night on the largely lonely road. Needless to say, those revelations would be fascinating and suggest that the incident might not have been a one-off encounter. Much of what each man recalled matched almost identically. They each recalled being in a strange dark tunnel that appeared very similar to an underground parking garage, before eventually emerging into the Red City with tall buildings all around them. Neither of them had recalled this apparent tunnel network previously. There were also other memories, and their recall of the city sparked into them, Carmelo, for example, suddenly had the revelation that he and both of his parents had seen two UFOs hovering over their home several months previously. Might this suggest not just Carmelo, but his parents had been victims of alien abduction before? In fact, each of the men began to reveal just such an encounter, but then abruptly stopped, almost as if they were forbidden from speaking of it. This is a detail that often comes up in regression sessions concerning alien abduction, as if some kind of mental control or block has been placed in a person's mind. What lends the claims of Francisco and Carmelo Nunees even more credible are seemingly corroborating sightings of strange aerial objects on the night of the encounter. Such two witnesses were 48-year-old Gilberto Caballero and 35-year-old Marcus Palmer. They claimed that on the morning of the encounter, they each witnessed what appeared to be a fleet of UFOs moving across the skies. They estimated these mysterious craft must have been at a relatively low altitude as they were moving in and out of the pylons in the area. What's more, they were not the only witnesses to the objects, claiming that around 50 other motorists and residents also saw them. Palmer would describe these futuristic vehicles as being round and extremely bright, elaborating that they moved in a bizarre figure-8 pattern. He would estimate there were approximately 30 of these curious craft and that they appeared to be around the size of a small car. In total, this otherworldly fleet remained in sight for around half an hour before disappearing from view. Caballero would offer much the same as his friend, although he would recall something even more intriguing. In the distance, sometimes obscured by the cloud, was a much larger object that was simply hovering there, completely motionless and silent. The media would focus their attention on the incident, so much so that Mendoza police felt the need to issue various official and unofficial comments. They offered that, although they didn't investigate UFO sightings, there was concern for the public due to the sheer number of reports around the same time Francisco and Carmelo had their encounter. Many officers, though, would describe the two witnesses off the record as being honest and reliable people, with one officer stating that although they didn't know what had happened to the pair, they very much believed that something had happened to them. The person who had overseen the regression sessions, Dr. Alfredo Stefanelli, agreed with the police's overall assessment. He concluded, without a doubt, that the two men were undeniably telling the truth. He further offered that just the obscure, elaborate and random nature of the account suggested it was not orchestrated or manufactured by the pair. Further still, it was highly unlikely that the pair had experienced some kind of group hallucination, perhaps not least due to the fact that both men recalled hearing the strange music. In short, as bizarre as their account may be, most who have investigated it have concluded it to be an authentic encounter. Perhaps more importantly, neither man would ever deviate from his version of events, despite being questioned and asked about them many times. Just what did happen to the father and son that evening on the Argentinian road? Were they abducted by aliens? What was the purpose of the tall buildings? Had they somehow been transported to an alien city somewhere else in the universe? Or were these apparent extraterrestrial buildings some kind of projection made to make it appear as though they were elsewhere instead of merely inside a huge spacecraft? And if this was the case, why? How much more might the pair have been unable to recall? The incident remains a complete mystery.